Jennifer. Okay, wonderful. So again, welcome to Mental Health and Self-Care for Caregivers. And moving on to the next slide, we can look at our preface. So what we're going to be talking about today contains a description about and a discussion to our early life experiences. So some of these kinds of thoughts might cause some memory, some discomfort, so please give yourself permission to stop watching and do something that feels safe and comfortable. This is part of the Paralysis Community Live Better series. We did, the previous webinar was on the art of managing worry and anxiety, and perhaps you tuned into that, and if not, it is in the YouTube section or the Reeve Foundation's YouTube page. And today we'll be focusing, as we said, on mental health and self-care for caregivers. So we're all caregivers, caring for ourselves at least, right? In the beginning, that's the first person and most important care that we give. And today we're all a range of listeners. So there may be things that are very pertinent for you. Other things maybe don't apply. So please know there may be other listeners that will benefit from that. And so take what's important to you, and the rest you can leave or pass on to another person. So today we'll be using in January, on January 8th at 2:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we will be having our mindfulness webinar. And it's been a progression. You know, we talked about managing worry and anxiety. Today we'll put that into a perspective of our overall mental health. And we've talked about elements of mindfulness in each of those categories there in those webinars. And then the mindfulness one we'll delve a little bit more deeply in. So important to note is that this content is not intended to replace medical care or counseling, and if you are seeing a behavioral health professional, please do consult with them before applying any of the content. So next slide, please. So in the webinar on managing worry and anxiety, this is a slide we used from there, and it's a good way to get us started for today. So I asked folks to consider if this is something that we say to ourselves. The first one, I'm a worrier. This is just the way I am, because our thoughts shape our beliefs and they shape our behaviors. And can we find a way, use some techniques and make some considerations to transition that, to use resilience to I'm a warrior. This is just the way I am. And if that doesn't feel believable, maybe this is the way I'm becoming. So slide, please. And our overall aim today is to support our mental health care and our role as carer. Okay, and we'll be looking at our earlier experiences that may provide some insight as to why we do the things we do and how we might reveal ways that care of ourselves can be released and open. So this session today in particular, we're going to consider aspects of good mental health. We're going to explore ways that behavioral patterns or layers of experience that we learned while growing up might influence our self-care thoughts, beliefs, and habits. And then, of course, the experience of paralysis as another layer that interacts and perhaps reopens those earlier patterns. So there is that interplay. And we're going to be also discussing techniques to shift these patterns and encourage the flow of healthier habits. Slide, please. So we will start with a question for your consideration today. What are some of our psychological, emotional, and social needs? What are these? So you might be right away thinking of some, or some of you might be saying, that's a good question. What are those needs? What are those things that are up there on the screen? Slide, please. And in fact, these are aspects of our mental health. So psychological, emotional, and social needs. And the ones that we're going to focus today, I've picked 4 of them that I consider to be some basic ones. The first one is our sense of safety and security. The next one is our sense of self. And then we have autonomy. which is our choice and our mastery of our environment, all the aspects of our environment. So we can see, and our connection as well, our capacity for building relationships. So we can see, again, the layers of this experience of this when we're young, and then added to that maybe the experience that we have now with being a carer for someone with paralysis, and perhaps being someone with paralysis who's also a caregiver, right? So these layers add. And how often do we think about these? And do we think about them as connected to our mental health? They're essential to our mental health. And how then this gets connected to our self-care. So again, maybe questions that you've been thinking about, or questions that maybe you might consider today and then moving forward. Next slide, please. So as we said, mental health is the state of our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It's influenced by many factors, including our genetics, our physical health, our environment, our lifestyle, our access to resources, other potential inequalities that exist in our society. Again, particularly if we think about things like universal design and, other inequalities, stigma, and more. And in terms of stigma, there is some information on the Reeve Foundation website. There's a blog there and some other writings and various types of stigma, including our own self-stigma, our own impressions about mental health and our accessing of care versus not accessing of the care. So mental health then affects how we think, how we feel, how we act and interact. It's always in some degree of flux. We aim for balance, right, in our life. If we think of a seesaw on a playground, but life happens. So 1 minute we're up and we might be down, and so the position changes. But if we can aim for balance, it's less, less of a flux. All right, so that's what we try to do, and we're guided by a combination of our biology and our cumulative life experience. And all of this starts from when we're young. Next slide, please. And we'll be thinking about our own early caregivers. These are our parents, or parent, foster or fosters, older siblings, relatives, teachers, babysitters, coaches. I mean, it can be a very long list of who our early caregivers might have been. But perhaps also we cared for our own self, maybe a good part of our growing up, and maybe even some younger siblings. So there again, the range there. And what we're talking about today is not intended to blame, shame, or anything else to our early nurturers or ourselves, because we trust that we did the best and they did the best amidst the experiences of life. And I also want to just make a note that our focus today is not on forgiveness. Whatever we experience, choosing forgiveness is solely up to us. It's a decision we make. And at the same time, we can honor the things we learned from any and all of these caregivers that have been helpful to us, and as well as how they did shape our resilience and continue to shape our resilience. And what we can aim to do now, and what we've been doing in our period of, as we age, is aim to understand ourselves, right? So we can be self-nurturers and nurture those in our care with clarity and with balance. So next slide, please. So this is a photo of a playground, and right away we might say that it needs a dose of universal design, right? It needs to be made a little more accessible. But if we can also look at it, that maybe this larger figure, the metal figure, is the grown-up, and it's a child with layers on, right? Which is what we're talking about today. And some of those layers might be running towards an experience or running away from an experience. It might be the fun of, that's experienced, or the fear. And I think we can see that in the picture as well. It might be that we are aware of other people on this journey with us. There might be in front of us, behind us, right next to us in the line, or they might be off to the side. So some people will be traveling on a similar path. Other people will be, on the same playground of life, but, maybe with different experiences. So This quote by Woody Harrelson, I liked it, is a grown-up with the layers, child with layers, okay? And these are the layers we're going to be talking about. So next slide, please. So let's, as we start to get into some of the content, maybe have some attention to a nice seated posture and one that feels perhaps centered and balanced for you. Maybe you can make any adjustments that would feel comfortable. And consider a deep breath or whatever type of breath would create some ease in your experience. And you can do this at any point during the presentation. If you're feeling the need to do that, it's a nice thing to do anyway. Or as I said, you can take a pause and then watch the presentation in the YouTube channel. Next slide, please. So as we begin, we'll look at a good place to start is, what did we see while we were growing up, right? What were the self-care habits that were modeled for us? Were we coached to use care routines? If so, how are we coached to use care routines? So our early carers may have not done a lot of self-care. Maybe they worked long hours. Maybe they traveled quite a bit. They had several jobs, whatever their situation with that. Maybe their own life experiences or early patterns or life challenges. Maybe there was some substance use or misuse. Maybe they simply just taught us as a value to put others first. That was a family value maybe that we learned. Maybe our carers had a somewhat rigid routine that may have left us feeling that self-care was unattainable, that it was just took too long or it was too hard or you had to have the right things. Or maybe, and likely, it was something in between. So maybe there was some balance there. But even if we had the most wonderful carers, these carers are and were human, and part of their role was to validate us or to help us improve parts of our life. I mean, that's what a carer, part of the role of a carer, right? We may have interpreted also that help improve was disapprove, or maybe it was or it felt disapproving to us. Either way, we know that life presents us with so many ways to spot these generations of held beliefs, right? And we realize sometimes that these are not even our beliefs if we haven't thought them through. These are the beliefs that were passed down generationally. And some experiences can create a possible challenge to our sense of security, our sense of self, our autonomy, our capacity for relationships. So we may have felt corrected, criticized. Maybe there was some experience of abuse, and knowing also that verbal abuse is not innocuous because it does shape things for us. Maybe there was some experience of trauma and of course, the illness. Next slide, please. So research indicates that most of us, 92% of us, have had at least one adverse life event that could lead to anxiety, depression, or other mental and physical health concerns. On the other end of that spectrum, research indicates as well that we can build the resilient mental health needed to adapt amidst challenging events. And we're exploring that today. Next slide, please. And what we'll review today are 3 patterns. There are more than 3. We're just going to select 3. And these are patterns that may be consistent with elements of perfectionism, elements of pretending, and elements of people-pleasing. So we'll be generalizing somewhat, so not everything may apply directly, and there is overlap, okay? So there, especially between perfectionism, pretending. We'll ask that you watch for any tendency towards judgment, either of yourself or others, and labeling, because we are not saying I'm a perfectionist or I'm a people pleaser, but we have maybe some of those elements in our behavior. So what we need to do is sort of backward chain to what the beliefs were, what the thoughts were. And if you remember, those of you that attended the anxiety webinar, we talked about, when did you feel that worry? And what was the time before that? And the time before that? Okay, so we're kind of going back to where it all started. Okay, so watching the tendency to label that we are not our behaviors. Possible attitude we might hold is we're simply getting to know more parts of ourselves. Okay, next slide, please. And after exploring these three patterns, we're going to look at how we might apply resilience, our awareness and balancing, to the four areas that support our mental health. Because part of everyone's social, psychological, and emotional health is to learn how to fill in our needs. Next slide, please. So let's begin, and we'll start with the elements of perfectionism. And this is a situation maybe where high demands were placed upon us. Perhaps there was some controlling of our behavior in ways that felt criticizing to us or correcting to us. There may have been some possible verbal or other abuse, or not. And perhaps while growing up, we heard phrases like, you'll need an A+, not just an A, to do things like get into college, to prove yourself, to be able to support your family, etc. Another thing we may have heard, you're not as good or as smart or whatever as your sibling. Another thing we may have heard was, you'll never, and then insert whatever it is, for instance, cut the salad cucumbers properly, or be able to write with a pen, so you better keep using a pencil that has an eraser, okay? Another thing we may have heard was, I know what's best for you. And, our early carers, in fact, that's part of their role until we can slowly start to take that over, right? And one of the ones that I just marvel at every time I read it or think about it, and it goes like this: good, better, best. Never let it rest until your good is better and your better is best. So, have you heard that? It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's got multiple potential effects, doesn't it? It's got some striving, it's got some achieving, it's got, and then we may look at that and feel that we're going to give some pushback, right? Or it may, if you see never let it rest, it can exhaust us, and never letting it rest is not doing self-care. So, and when is your better best? When is best enough, and where are we comparing it? So the thing about these phrases is that they can be positive, and I'm sure that they were said with positive intent, but we also need to keep some balance. And in each of these elements, I'm going to talk about the implication for relationship with self, all right? In this case, the elements of perfection may lead us to a decreased opportunity to explore ourself. Possibly we might be thinking, I'm who you want me to be. My early caregivers, I'm who you want me to be. I follow what you say to be accepted in this family, in this classroom, on this team. And in fact, folks that have elements of perfectionism may not be team sports joiners, right? They may prefer more individual competitions or pursuits, okay? Other implications might be that they had less opportunity for choosing, for trying, for making mistakes, for restarting. And if we have less tolerance of this with ourselves, perhaps we may have a tendency to extend this to others as well. Perhaps not, but it's something to think about. Next slide, please. And then we have these beliefs that we internalize. These experiences are there, and we internalize them, and we do it to protect ourselves from the early experience. And this is part of what we call our inner critic. It's part of our psyche. It's part of our ego. And with the elements of perfectionism, we may hear ourselves mentally saying, why bother? It won't be good enough anyway. I won't be good enough anyway. I'll just make a mistake. Or we might be hearing ourselves or our inner critics saying, no one else can do this the way I do it. I do it the right way. Or we might hear, and it may be that we do know the right way, okay, but there's this underlying piece there. There may be another one, I'm better or smarter or whatever than others. I don't really need anyone else. I don't have time for friends. And this may all be as a way to compensate for the effects of overachieving amongst peers, right? And then it can be so isolating. And the potential effects then on our self-care, if we've grown up with any or some of these elements or other elements that you may be inserting on your own right now, might be that we don't like to be questioned about self-care, right? And we may even be adamant in saying, I'm an excellent time manager, okay? Don't question me about it. Or we may feel, and in fact, time, especially in paralysis care, I don't like to think about self-care as managing time better. I think about it as managing energy better. Not better, but managing it and switching tasks, which we'll talk about. So another potential effect on self-care is that we may feel we have more important things to do. We may look at self-care as frivolous, or we may think that it's about pampering. And in fact, as you see already from these 4 mental health areas, that these are essential areas, and there's nothing wrong with pampering, but that's not what we're talking about today. We may have an effect where we fear being seen not as smart, strong, or resourceful enough if we ask for help. And we may be less likely to risk delegating, or less likely to risk asking for help, or we may have some sensitivity receiving feedback. So these are, this is some of the effects of the elements of perfectionism. And moving on now, let's look at the next slide, which is an element of what we call pretending. And it's a close cousin of perfectionism. Possibly we were parentified as children. We may have felt we had to be superhuman to rise to every occasion. We may feel we had to save the day, and maybe we did if we were parentified, right? We may be the person that stays up late even if it's not necessary, and maybe it is necessary, but we're attending to all of the details instead of getting that sleep, or feeling guilty if something gets missed. But in general, kind of overdoing what needs to be done. Okay, and potential phrases heard from early caregivers here might be, I'm watching you, and, possibly waiting for you to make a mistake, or finding you don't know, or understand something. You may have heard, what will the neighbors think, right? What's the image that we're projecting here? You may have heard, you'll never amount to anything, or why can't you be more like? It's an innocent, especially if there are, multiple siblings at home, or, in a classroom situation. Why can't you be more like your older or younger sister or brother, or whatever? And then another one is, you have to work hard in life. So, and is that at risk of loving what you do? Do we, can it be both? The relationship with self here, with the element of pretending, may be a decreased trust in self and feeling like an imposter. So you may know your stuff. You may know exactly that care routine, but there is maybe some of that self-doubt. Okay, and that is because perhaps of an early pretending pattern that was followed. Next slide, please. So some of the elements of pretending then, beliefs we may have internalized or things that we tell ourselves are, if you snooze, you lose, right? So you may have heard that, time is money, right? If you rest, the message is, you'll lose something, okay? My work is never ending. There's always more I can do. It has to be done right. I'm too busy to go to the bathroom. How many of us have said that? And sometimes maybe it is an essential thing that must be done immediately in caregiving, and sometimes we can go to the bathroom, okay? So we are busy, and there's so much to do, but is there some reason that we're not going to take care of our bodily needs, our own bodily needs? And somewhere along the line, when we were younger, was the idea of being busy connected somehow with not being lazy. Do we feel that resting is a sign of laziness? And busy looks like we know what we're doing. So And often we know what we're doing, we just are caught in this pattern. Okay, another belief we may have internalized is, I can't let my guard down. I'm just waiting for people to find out that I'm not as good or smart or resourceful or, energetic as they think. And this can also be isolating. We can also, in this case, be sensitive about making mistakes. And our potential effect on self-care is that we may say we're doing great, and maybe we're not. And we may say that everything's fine, and maybe it's not. Maybe we feel we can't let anybody know something about us, so we're not joining a support group, or we're not, connecting online with others. Or maybe we don't want people to see us in a condition where we don't have it all together, right? We may think that we would be seen as weak or inadequate if we ask for help. And there's a lot of energy in preserving what we think about our image. What will the neighbors think? Okay? Next slide, please. And with the element of people-pleasing, that's our next one. Likely we were criticized, possibly rejected, and in this case for no apparent reason. Likely there was maybe verbal abuse or other abuse, and maybe we competed for attention, maybe with others in the family, in the classroom, on the team. And potential phrases maybe we heard from early caregivers were, it's the only thing I ask of you, so the guilt. Or if you do this, extra chores or, this errand or whatever, I'll be very happy with you. So there was some condition there. And another one perhaps, do you think money grows on trees? So the relationship with our own self here is, who I am is not enough. There are conditions placed on my acceptance and questions about worthiness. Next slide, please. And some of the beliefs we may have internalized, or the inner critic tells us even now, is that I have to say yes to get in favor with others or to stay in favor. I have to avoid conflict, or try to avoid conflict. Apologizing, even when it's not something that you have responsibility for. It may be that we say we have a hard time saying no, since we don't like letting people down. And maybe we think, or maybe we've said, no one loves me, no one cares about me, I'm not important. Again, very isolating. And the potential effect on self-care here is that we are more likely to say no to ourselves because our needs are less important. We may feel unable to ask for what we need. We may not know what we need here, right, because we're too busy knowing what others need. And we may feel guilty about or not worthy of spending time on ourselves or money, on ourselves as well, because money doesn't grow on trees, right? Next slide, please. So, as we said, it's not possible to grow up without experiencing various combinations of some of these patterns and other patterns. This is just maybe gives you a framework for how you might look at early patterns that you experienced. And again, everybody's experience is different, so we're just kind of doing a broad brushstroke here. But if we were to sort of bring it under the lens of our 4 mental health factors we've selected for today, there is some common elements here. So if we look at our sense of security, our sense of self, our basic safety may have been compromised. Physical insecurity maybe was there. And physical insecurity can lead to emotional insecurity, or maybe it was solely emotional security. And this is where worry lives, where anxiety has its root, and blurred boundaries, okay? And then in terms of our sense of self, this may have challenged our self and our self-esteem, which are 2 different things, our feelings of worthiness, our trust and confidence in our abilities, okay? The key word here being depletion. Autonomy and mastery and environment. If it was challenged for us to make decisions or to think about change, we may keep ourselves busy and avoid our emotions. And the key word here is exhaustion. And then in our 4th category of connection, the capacity for relationships, We may have deduced that love is conditional. We expect rejection or failure. We may seek out, partners or companions or friends or whatever that also fulfill this for us, and it just reinforces that pattern. And so then we may seek or avoid it altogether, which again is isolation. So it takes a lot of energy to carry forward these patterns in life. So worry, depletion, exhaustion, and isolation. And as I said, we'll talk about the energy exchange versus managing time later. But let's see now how we can shift these 4 aspects. And we'll begin with fostering security by looking at the inner critic. Next slide, please. So as we said, this inner critic is part of our psyche that evolved early in life to protect us. Don't try that because this is just going to happen, okay? And that became wired in our neural circuitry. And these are the things that in some form or fashion, underlying everything at the bottom, with all these layers, we still may say to ourselves that keep us in that pattern perhaps and build more insecurity rather than security. And most of us have this inner critic function, okay? It plays it plays good roles for us as well. And the important question is, how do we decide when to listen to it and when to manage it? And we can determine when it's not helpful. We can dial it down. We do have a choice. Next slide, please. We said earlier that our repeated thoughts become our beliefs, and these inform our behaviors. So when we're under alert, when we're under stress, when we're under deadline, when we're under pressure, when we're confronted with a whole new way of living and being, it's harder to remember that these are not thoughts and beliefs, and we identify with them a little bit more then. And when we're under this alert, we might be in fight mode, flight mode, or freeze mode. We've heard this before. And in flight mode, we've heard about our buttons being pushed. So the emotions turn into emotional storms. And again, the roots might be in our early experiences. And we can fight with ourselves as well. In flight mode, this might be our avoidance behaviors, our avoidance of self-care completely, or other avoidance behaviors resulting from early experiences. This might be overuse or unhelpful use of the computer. We may soothe ourselves with eating behaviors, substance misuse. And in freeze mode, this may be the inaction due to, being fearful of failure or mistakes. Maybe we're unable to express our emotions. We're stuck in anger that we can't, or we haven't expressed, or stuck in our thought ruminations. So could these be connected with a lot of our strong emotions? Absolutely. Next slide, please. So, we want to learn then how to establish some ways to manage our inner critic. And we can do that by starting with managing these thoughts. And in the anxiety webinar, we talked about 3. We're going to add a new one, and we're going to expand a little further here. So we talked about, is this thought a new or repeat thought? So sometimes repeated thoughts that are involved with, distress, they really target our alert system. But if we can name it, it can decassette it. Okay. We can also look at if the thought is an unhelpful thought, can we shift it to be more helpful or neutral? And if it's a neutral thought, can we shift that to be a little more helpful and believable? And is it a past, present, or future thought? Okay, and can we keep our thoughts present focused? Okay, and so you can go back to that webinar if you'd like to have a more full discussion. A good part of that webinar focused on our thought management, and we'll add a new one here. Is it a judgment or is it a fact? So if we say to ourselves, I'm not going to be successful at this, a particular aspect of self-care or even a caregiving routine that we need to do, is that a judgment? Because the fact is that our thoughts are not facts, and this may be a risk that's safe to take, and we can assess that safety. So we can talk to our inner critic and with some kindness as well. So we can say to our inner critic, what is it that I'm most worried about? and we can anticipate what that might be and answer it, what my inner critic's concerns are going to be. And we can say to ourselves, I've seen others making mistakes. I know everyone makes mistakes. So that idea of success, what is that really? And we can say to ourselves, that's just my inner critic being overly helpful. It means well. And we can say to ourselves, where did this come from, this thought or this belief? And we say, oh, yes, this is similar to what someone said to me repeatedly while I was growing up. So we can see where it comes from. And the other thing we can do is consider just giving ourselves permission to get started without even thinking about, is it going to be successful? Okay, we just get started and we stay in the present moment with whatever that is. Okay, next slide, please. Another way we can work with our inner critic is to find the inner nurturer within that inner critic, because it does, that ego wants to be helpful to us as well. It wants to protect us. So we can thank it and we can appreciate the role that it plays in our life and that it played in our life. And we can partner with it to turn the dial down, ask it to support us in self-care experience that can bring healing and growth. We can also take a step back and find ways to remember feeling safe and encouraged, or to remember, whatever might be, some of the positive experience of what we're feeling. And our emotional security can help us to stay present, to help manage the worries and fears that impact our self-care and are related to caregiving with or for paralysis. Okay, so our emotional security can help us as we think about safety and security to manage the worries and the fears. Next slide, please, as we move on to our sense of self. Next slide, please. When we feel that sense of security and safety that we just talked about, we have more room to explore the self, and exploring the self in its resilient marvel and wonder, although we may not be feeling that because of our day-to-day life experiences. Our conditioned early patterns often place us in a long history of stress reacting, and we get stuck in a cycle. Everything can't get done, or the way we think it should get done. We feel badly about it. We try even harder, and all of our inner scripts increase their volume. And the neural circuitry just gets reinforced. But if we can create balance in our alert nervous system, we can start to see the patterns and the reactions. And then we can create more consciously, with more awareness, new actions to support ourselves as a human being rather than as a human doing. And in human doing life, our experience seems not to make sense. Our life seems to not have meaning and purpose there. We are talking here about doing versus being mode, and social self versus inner self. So doing exhausts us. Doing is that being, that's exhausting, as opposed to our social self, which is our inner self, or social self versus the inner self. So doing mode is social self, rather, and being mode is inner self. Sorry about that. And our goal is to experience life with presence. That is what is more likely to fuel us, as opposed to just doing without presence. Next slide, please. So self, that concept, is the most important, perhaps one of the longest relationships we'll ever have. And not always, unfortunately, but perhaps. And the anxieties or the activities and practices that allow for some introspection can support being. And from this place, we can consider, who am I? And what do I value most? This builds the courageous and purposeful, empathic inner self and caregiver. Can we see ourselves as complete? Can we feel that we're enough? Can we look at our expectations, and are they realistic? No one's love can completely fill the void of not loving our own self. And in terms of connection with self, can we nurture ourselves in the places we feel missed while growing up? Again, no one is perfect. And what is it that you would have wanted to have heard? And resilience answers us with, don't worry, it takes time and practice to write with a pen, calling upon our earlier experience. And I have confidence in you, okay, that you're not a person that is going to need that eraser, and if you need that eraser, then you'll use it beautifully, right, or if you want to use it. And it's okay. There's not just one way to cut cucumbers. They'll taste the same, and it'll be nice to have a change from how the cucumbers look. Okay, so in this case, it adds the perspective of how we view change. Do we avoid change, or do we embrace it? And how that was patterned early may have an effect on us now. And of course, our life now is changing and ever-changing every day. Okay, next slide, please. And thinking on building upon the idea of embrace, and embrace by filling in as our own self-nurturer, we can take a few minutes, maybe just a pause, 1 or 2 minutes a day or every couple of hours, with breathing into the embrace right into our own self, also called a hug. And this releases endorphins, which make us feel good, and I have a nice protective factor here for the self. And another thing that we can do is wrap ourselves in the embrace of a weighted item, like a blanket, a lap blanket, a shawl, a vest. And these are articles like that of clothing and blankets where the pellets are sewn in that add differing weights. And these can be helpful with mental health challenges, anxiety, insomnia. They can be helpful with pain. They've been shown to be helpful with autism. And they can self-calm us. These are more widely available now, and the cost has actually started to come down. They have been pretty expensive, and I saw one recently for $30 in one of the stores that are a little bit more of a cost-saving type store. So in public ads and public perceptions on the websites, they recommend 10% of these pellets be the body weight. And they also seem to be advertised quite widely for sleeping. However, the therapeutic effect, if we're looking for a purely therapeutic effect, the research shows up to 20% of the body weight will help. Now, that might feel really heavy for people, so we say up to. And shorter sessions, not for all-night sleeping, up to 20 minutes, because the body will acclimate, and just like the medicines, we'll have a tolerance, and we'll need more and more. So you can use it how you like, right, as long as it's safe, but knowing the difference about what the research says for the therapeutic effect is helpful. And you can consult your healthcare professional before buying it, or to make sure that it can be returned. And you can try it quickly and say, oh, that's too heavy, or gee, maybe we can go up closer to the 15% or the 18% of the body weight. Now, in terms of safety, please be able to remove it yourself. It's not for under 2-year-olds. Not a good idea for smaller animals that can get into the blanket or whatever. No use of pressure sores, obstructive sleep apnea, asthma, or claustrophobia. So that may be a way to build our connection with our inner self and our sense of being. We can just have a moment of self-containment there. Next slide, please. Another way we can build connection with ourselves is with self-compassion. So self-esteem is something that can be variable. Self-compassion is more of a constant. It's more of an action we can take. Self-compassion is more than being nice. In fact, there are a lot of therapies that are emerging now that incorporate self-compassion and compassion. So this increases, according to the research, our self-acceptance by calming and centering us in the present. It impacts our mental health, our psychosocial functioning by buffering trauma. It mitigates early childhood experiences and emotional distress. It influences the brain pathways that inhibit fear and activates courage and hope circuitry in the brain. So it expands our window of tolerance so we can become less identified with our suffering. So in other words, transmuting the worrier to warrior. Okay, this is who I am and who I am becoming. And actually, we're wired physiologically for compassion through our vagus nerve. And a lot of the social research out of some of the social learning libraries are really have, in the past, maybe 10, 15 years, really been researching and talking about the vagus nerve and calling it the nerve of compassion for the effect that we just described on the body. And it mobilizes the body to nurture places that we may still feel vulnerable. And to repeat something important, we can be our own nurturer and reparent those vulnerable areas. Next slide, please. And here's something that we can do. So you can replay this back and take more time doing it. In the interest of time, we're just going to go through it a little more quickly. So this is from a children's book going on our theme of early childhood experiences. I put my hand on my heart and listen. And that is where I find the answer. I have compassion. I act with tenderness. I am love. Okay? So many of the times we are in our head. Our awareness is in our head. And if we can shift that down to the heart, and when we think about the heart, we think of the center of the chest, not where our actual heart is, but the center of the chest. And that is actually the place where the vagus nerve is most acceptable to us. Okay? The vagus nerve comes down from the brainstem through the vocal cords, through the top of the chest area and into the gut. So, and this is the children's book, I Am Love, A Book of Compassion by Susan Verde and illustrator Peter H. Reynolds. And he's illustrated a lot of children's books. So another thing that I think is could be nurturing that you can think about is being read to. And sometimes it's a luxury of time, but these kinds of things can be a nice interaction between friends, family members, caregivers, professionals, etc. So next slide, please. So our summary statement here for building connection with the self is that acceptance and love of self is really essential self-care. So we work on that, and we trust that if we can build our acceptance, that can love us through all the aspects of paralysis caregiving and remind us really about what matters most. So let's move now on to mastery. Next slide, and the next slide after that. So seeing what matters most, which we did in the previous section when we talked about our sense of self, opens us up to making our own choices and choices for what matters most to us. And maybe early on our choices were made for us, and many of them were, and maybe that helped us develop a fixed mindset, and we allowed that to continue as we aged. And maybe we knew we had some choice in theory, but here's where we start exercising it, right? And this includes physical, emotional, and social navigation. And with a life-changing condition like paralysis, we're relearning this, right? Relearning all of these areas. And we learn and we build skills. This is a growth mindset. So shifting from, or asking myself, am I operating with a fixed mindset, or is there some room for a growth mindset? And of course, we're bombarded by opportunities for the growth mindset. And we look, though, how were our early decision-making skills? What is my capacity right now? And does it go right to overwhelm because it is already overwhelming? Or are there some areas that I can do some filling in here of some of the gaps? So with practice and with commitment, we can reinforce the new neural circuits, and we can start to feel that we're developing our mastery and our autonomy in our new landscape. New slide, please. And we can develop tolerance of our mistakes, maybe, whereas before in early life or early childhood, maybe that was a challenge. Maybe we can even start to expect and embrace them as a natural part of learning and apply the learning to try again. Feeling secure in who we are sets the stage to trust ourselves more. And we think about, and we may even get a better sense of our boundaries. And we give ourselves permission to say no, not yet, or not right now. And we practice that. And working off of what matters most, we honor our absolute yes list. And what's that? An absolute yes list is maybe a very short list of the people or the situations where no matter what we're doing, we stop and we attend to that, right? So not everything is a code that is urgent, right? And in having an absolute yes list, it gives us even more permission to say no, not yet, or not right now. Okay? So then bringing closure to this section, our mastery of our environment can help us to work with the changed and ever-changing landscape of paralysis caregiving. It lays the foundation also for innovation. And this is a place where we can add our own creativity, our own personal touches, our own understanding. And so moving then on, we'll look now at connection. And connection is our decision to take a step outside of isolation. So it's just something to think about. Have I been isolating myself? And in what ways? And, we might have a lot of reasons for that. And maybe some of those, you have some answers for now, and this is a way that we might share our vulnerabilities and our common humanity. We may even consider things like asking for help so that we can learn from each other. We may even then be able to depend on someone that we delegate responsibility so we can have some time for self-care, even though knowing that it takes time to learn all of the care routines, and especially knowing that someone else is going to do it differently, and then finally knowing that mistakes can be made. So what we build our capacity to hold all of this. Next slide, please. So when we think about resilience, sometimes we see it as an individual's response or experience that responds to life's challenging. But is it more? It incorporates all of the previous attributes we talked about for mental health, the security, the sense of self, navigating the environment physically, psychologically, emotionally, and socially. But we are saying then, is it more than just one person's journey resilience? And if so, what and where are the resources to do this? And who are the people I might connect with? And where are they? Where can I find them? So we think about resilience maybe as a community, as not just as an individual's action. The Reeve Foundation is an example of an exceptional resilience community. Next slide, please. So, on the Reeve website, Reeve Foundation website, is Reeve Connect, as well as so many other, experiences to connect with peer mentors, with on the Reeve Connect there, and also the events that they attend and staff, and on the Reeve Connect we have various categories, especially for caregivers, and these may be the wives and girlfriends and other partners of persons who have spinal cord injury, or parents, that are talking about their experiences as caregivers. Next slide, please. So to do this, we then think about, when we're building our connection with others, with our communication and listening skills. So this is to both express ourselves, but also to be able to hold a space for others. And we can also think about a loving kindness type of meditation. That's another strategy. And in this type of meditation, we focus on the desired state that we want to feel. So in this case, it might be compassion, it might be ease, or balance, or love, or kindness. And if we were going to do this, we would take more time. I'm just going to walk you through it here, but we would start with the focus on ourself or myself by mentally repeating a phrase or phrases, a series of phrases that are progressive, like, may I feel kindness towards myself. And I might repeat that several times. May I be bathed in the feeling of kindness. And then I may progress to, may I become the source of kindness. So it's doing this in our own time and in our own way. And in the beginning, it may not feel as believable or effective, but it arises spontaneously, is a common observation that people have when they do this. And it's focusing then. You can actually put your hands over your heart and do this, or you can sit comfortably in any way. You can do it before bed, any way that feels right for you. You can practice it. And in time, so you do it aimed towards yourself, and when you are feeling that, then you can expand the phrase to others. So you can include the people that you love. And then you do that for a while, yourself first, always, and then the people you love. And then after some more time, you can include other people that we know. And then after more time, those we may have challenges with. And then perhaps all people, all beings, all sentient life. Okay, so it's building our perspective, it's building our connection, and in closing this section, our sense of connection can bring information, support, opportunity to hold vulnerability together, and remind each other of our innate wisdom and our courage. Okay, so next slide, please. Just a couple more additional thoughts. Next slide, please. We haven't really talked about time management, and we're really not going to here, but we are going to talk just briefly about energy evaluation. So with self-care, we hear a lot about the time part and a little less about the focus on the energy. And this is where we look at what is it that saps our energy the most, and really what do we think it would take to recover some of it? It may be that we look at, when I'm doing mental expenditures, I get really sapped, so maybe we switch to physical expenditure then. So switching of the task can help keep balance. It may be that I was doing a certain type of task that may be considered more left brain, and maybe I switch now to something that's more right brain, although the brain has the tasks really are cross brain. But, so there's plenty of tasks, obviously, to choose from, but our own self-care maybe can be one of them. But balancing those physical and mental expenditures a little bit, just switching off for a little bit can help. And the mental health factors that we talked about, the 4 of them, if we can work on these a little bit or consider them, and when we say work on them, we're thinking about them, we're considering them. Maybe we're taking a pause and practicing some of the breath practices and thinking about our sense of self and the who am I, and that will free up our energy and also restore our energy. Next slide, please. We can also look at our food and hydration intake, and there are some things again that might sap us. So it's always good to talk with your healthcare professional, and together, you giving all of your wise observations about yourself and how the food you have or the beverages you take make you feel. Do they make you feel balanced, or do they make you feel a little more scattered, or do they make you feel a little more lethargic? So again, playing with the energy piece of that. And then the last one I want to talk about really here is sleep. It's nature's gift for self-care and mental health. It's a basic need. And did we have pre-sleep routines when we were younger? And if we did, do we still follow them? Do we still carry them? Have we updated them? And if we didn't, how can we craft them? And also, are there 1 or 2 sleep hygiene strategies that we can implement? And what I might suggest here to think about, really, a lot of us are on the computer a lot, where maybe what are we doing that evokes images? Are they going to be restful images, or are these going to be images, again, that are not conducive to having a good sleep? So maybe thinking about limiting that screen time right before bed, an hour or so before bed. And acknowledging, really creating some awareness about when we're tired, when we're zapped, when we're exhausted, because mistakes happen more then, and doing something to rejuvenate. Again, even if it's just a pause, that we can do some stretches or do some range of motion exercises or some seated yoga or mat-based yoga to relieve bodily tension, and some breath-based practices, or a nap if we have more time. So next slide, please. So again, we've completed our session today, and again, we're looking at mindfulness to support life after paralysis next time. And if you haven't seen The Art of Managing Worry and Anxiety, that might be a good one to help with some of the thought management and some of the other techniques. And again, then the resources that are on the Reeve Foundation's website, and really would think that it's a good consideration to have some counseling, maybe particularly with the layers of concerns that we talked about today, varying degrees of experiencing concerns, if you feel it can be helpful for you. So counseling can be online even, it can be in person, there are groups, all types of different formats, and that's also, there's information about that in the Art of Managing Worry and Anxiety. So next slide, please. So in closing, we started with these questions, and we'll bring some closure. We'll bring a bookend here, again, honoring everybody that has been a part of our experience, and honoring ourselves, really, as central to that experience. And, we had a chance now to think about 4 of these mental health factors: security, self, relationships, and autonomy. And, we asked, how often do we think about them? So maybe this reinforced some of the things that you already knew or practiced. Maybe you understood their connection to mental health and self-care, and maybe these are some new things to think about. But hopefully, and next slide, please, I'll close with another child book reference that can be maybe helping us bring some closure. Today you are you, and that is true. Today you are you, that is truer than true. There is no one alive who is youer than you. So I embrace that for you. The Reeve Foundation embraces that for you. And I encourage you to find opportunities to embrace it for yourself as well. Okay? So it is just a little bit over our time because we had some tech challenges. I like to thank Rita for her great job in advancing the slides, and Savannah for her earlier assistance. Now, because I don't have control over the slides, I also cannot see if there are any questions. So Rita, if you can look in both the Q&A box, the questions box, these are places where there might be some questions?
No, there's none in there for now.
None for now. Okay. If maybe we'll take a moment here, and if anybody, I don't know if that's part of the technology, because usually I see a lot of feeds there. There are a lot of reminders there and things like that. So I see someone has their hand raised. So the person with your hand raised, I'm not going to say your name out of confidentiality, but can you please type your question? Okay, Chris. Did you say the recording or slides will be available? Yes, indeed. The recording and the slides will be there. And another person also, that you could get a copy of the PowerPoint. So what we'll do is have you go to the YouTube page of the Reeve Foundation. You're welcome, the person who raised your hand. And there it'll be there. And it'll take Rita a day or two maybe, or 3, what's the time frame do you think, Rita?
At least about a week or so, and then it will be uploaded to our YouTube page.
Yeah, and the anxiety one is there now, so you can look at that one in the meantime. So we have another thing here. Thank you for your feedback. I appreciate that. And you're saying you didn't realize it was just for caregivers who had someone with paralysis in their life, but for your mom with special health care needs. Okay. Well, you're welcome, and I'm glad that that'll have some application. And it does have application, because when we're talking about mental health, that's something we all are interested in, and caregiving, where we all also, there are a lot of things that we have in common, right? That's our common humanity. That's part of our ability. That's the piece where we can connect. So I'm looking to see if we have other hands raised, or and I'm looking in both areas here for questions. Anyone else having questions? Okay. Well, Rita, do you want to wait a little bit longer, or what are your thoughts?
Whatever you're comfortable with.
Okay.
Yeah.
So someone, if anyone's typing, well, I'll wait just another minute or two. Okay, so another question about the slides being available. And so they will be in the YouTube channel, okay, the Reeve Foundation, so you can subscribe to that actually. And there are so many other resources while you're there, so many other webinars and so many other things. So everything you saw on the screen will be there, okay? Okay, well, I will say again thank you to Rita, who was terrific in helping us here and with the technology part, and thank you to the Reeve Foundation for all you do, and also to Savannah, who is helping us on behalf of the ReadyTalk community. So we thank you to all of you that have tuned in, and if you can also you're welcome to post questions when you, if you want to, on that YouTube page underneath the webinar tape. All right, so that's it for today, and we will look for you on January 8th if you are interested in learning more about mindfulness in life after paralysis. So wishing everyone a good rest of the day.
And this concludes today's conference. Thank you for your participation, and you may now disconnect.